Thank you for joining us for today's Ipsos Inside Track webinar briefing featuring data and trends that will impact the 2024 elections. Today's webinar is being presented by experts from Ipsos's public political polling team. Throughout today's session, you will remain in listen-only mode. However, throughout the webinar, please submit your questions online using the Q&A feature. Our plan is to answer your questions at the end of today's session. However, if time runs short, then your question will be answered by email. Today's webinar is being recorded and will also be directly emailed to you. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome today's first speaker, Chris Jackson, Senior Vice President with Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen. Greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our September Ipsos Inside Track, where we go over the latest and greatest in our public opinion data produced here at Ipsos. We're glad to have you with us. I am joined, as usual, by our editorial director, Sarah Feldman, and data journalist, Bernard Mendez. We have a lot of information to go through with you today, so we will dive right in. But as always, this information is all public. It's been published. You're welcome to use it, share it. We will also be making this deck available and this webinar available in the next day or so, as Ellen mentioned, so you're also welcome to access it that way. So let's go over the agenda, what we have in front of us. Again, a lots to cover. I'll talk a little bit about what the main issues are facing the country. Sarah is going to do a little bit of a deep dive into the economy, which continues to sort of be the dominant issue, and some recent polling we did with Black Americans, which is a key part of the Democratic base and an important voting bloc, but is oftentimes a little understudied in standard national surveys. Bernard is going to be sharing some deep dive data from the debate, the presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump that we fielded about 2 weeks ago, as well as looking at some turnout scenarios and the potential impact of turnout on the election. So again, a little bit of a deep dive into the data. Then Sarah will look at the down ballot races and other things going on, because again, it's not just the presidential election, there's actually a lot going on. And then I'll conclude with a look at our presidential data and where our forecast is at the moment. So let's dive into the issue landscape. We are really not seeing a lot of differences or changes in the overall issue landscape. The economy continues to be the #1 issue in our core political tracking. This data is actually slightly out of date from August. We actually just got out of field yesterday with a new wave of it that shows basically the same thing. The economy continuing to be the #1 issue, political extremism, sort of a little bit of a gap in second, and then immigration, a bit more of a gap in third. So these are sort of the issues that frame the country. However, we've also done some separate research where we sort of mixed in issues like this, as well as sort of more personal things and some aspirational things, because again, if you have been following the election, you've gotten the impression that this is not necessarily something that's based on policies or facts. It is a bit of a vibes election. There's a lot of feelings that are being driven, that are driving what's happening. And in that, it's actually a bit more mixed, a bit more muddled, where inflation is definitely still in the mix, but it's not necessarily as dominant as, you know, a sense of someone who can create a sense of optimism or opportunity for folks, or someone who's going to fix the system. So again, this is sort of a traditional way of looking at it, but I think the truth is a little bit messier, a little bit more muddled, because I don't think in this very loud, chaotic media environment, it's not necessarily as clean and organized as this question may make it seem. Looking at the trend on this over the last couple of months, we've seen relatively consistently the economy as a leading issue. And it's interesting because it's actually sort of been going up as the economy has actually been getting a little bit better as inflation has eased. You know, and we saw the Fed reduce interest rates, the Federal Reserve rate rather, last week, which again, another sort of note that the inflation is sort of easing, and you know, sort of the Fed declaring that it's sort of over. And what's happening here is essentially what we've seen is that Republicans who had been pointing as immigration as their #1 issue have been essentially moving from that to the economy. So the immigration has sort of collapsed a little bit as a major Republican talking point, and instead the economy has been sort of where Republicans have been registering their what their sort of main concern is. So, which again, before Republicans are sort of more evenly split between immigration and the economy. So that's sort of driving a lot of that shift, and we're seeing that sort of continuing to happen with Republicans increasingly sort of pointing at the economy as their number one issue, potentially as more of a campaign effect than truly driven by what's going on in the economy, because we're seeing independents and Democrats sort of stable or not really changing on the economy as a main issue there. So anyways, that's going on here. I'm going to pass it over to Sarah now to actually talk about the economy, what we're seeing in the economy and our consumer confidence data, because again, we do think this is still the main issue. It is sort of the dominant issue of the campaign, the one that's probably going to be affecting the next 6 weeks. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks so much, Chris. Yeah, like Chris mentioned, the economy remains number one issue, but kind of a messy, muddled subject. So to start us off, we're looking to unpack that a little bit. We're looking at our consumer confidence tracker going back to 2002. And as you can see, over the past year or so, we've seen consumer confidence at that top line number really begin to perk up. Though I'll note that inflation has been coming down for a little bit longer than consumer confidence has been perking up. And what we really can see looking at this long trend of our consumer confidence index is that often consumer confidence can act as a lagging indicator to some of the macroeconomic movement happening in the wider economy. So we saw that in the early days of inflation. You know, even as inflation was rising fairly rapidly, consumer confidence still remained fairly high, and it took a while to kind of come down and match that very historic, acute experience of inflation people were being squeezed by. And we're seeing the same thing on the back end of this too. And that is really made clear when we look at our inflation proxies within the consumer confidence index. So these are people's comforts, really measuring people's comforts, making different types of purchases for their household over the past 6 months. And when we take that kind of half year, 6 month view, we can really see that many Americans are still feeling a little uncomfortable. That comfort level is rising relative to other points in the past year or so, but certainly not at the rosy pieces or rosy sentiment we saw right out of the post-vaccine boom in 2021 and even before the pandemic in January 2020. And again, what that tells me is that when all of this news is breaking about the Fed rate cuts and even cooling job numbers that we saw kind of happen over the past month or so, it usually takes consumers and the consumer confidence index a little bit to catch up to some of that news as it trickles down and throughout the rest of the economy. So, you know, the space to watch over the next 6 weeks in the lead up to election day is really, you know, how do Americans begin to feel kind of these changes, these slow, gradual, big changes in the economy. And, you know, we can't say for certain what might happen in the next 6 weeks and how people might feel about it, but, you know, that is kind of the trend and context to build around some of this as we absorb the Fed rate cut news and those cooling job numbers. Now with that, I will turn over to our survey or section where we look a little bit at how Black Americans are feeling about the country and politics right now. And like Chris said, you know, Black Americans tend to be a really understudied group within a national Gen Pop survey. So we have been running this really interesting and great piece of research with the Washington Post going all the way back to January 2020, surveying specifically Black Americans. And we have this great time series, and through that we can really see that right now in September 2024, 3 in 5 Black Americans say that now is a good time to be a Black person in the US. Now that is certainly higher, almost the inverse of how Black Americans were feeling in January 2020 at the tail end of Trump's first term. And, you know, even looking at the past year and a half, even looking at earlier this year, Black Americans were not feeling as generally good about their place in the country. And so this uptick in optimism has also brought with it some changes in politics as well and the likelihood to vote. So here we're looking at registered Black voters and their certainty to vote for different candidates this cycle. Earlier this year in 2020, in April, we saw about 3 in 4 registered Black voters saying that they definitely or probably vote for Biden. We've seen Harrison Walz really make some significant gains with this group. over time, over the summer. But what's important even to remember that even as Harris and Walz has gained really with Black registered voters, she's still polling, her poll numbers there are still softer than what we saw with Biden in June of 2020. In June of 2020, when we looked at this question of who you're going to vote for and the certainty of that, we saw that Biden won about 92% of Black registered voters. So again, there's still the difference between winning and losing is those margins and how close Harris can really get to some of what we saw in 2020 or in other elections in the past. So this is these margins are very important spaces to watch as we get closer to the election. There's certainly ground that Harris has made up relative to where Biden stood with Black Americans earlier this year, but there's certainly still ways to go as well. So really important note and space to watch, and something that Bernard will be touching on in his turnout analysis. So before I get ahead of myself, I'll kick it over to Bernard, who will walk us through the debate and some really interesting analysis he did on turnout. Over to you, Bernard.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so going to start off talking a bit about the second presidential debate. So interest around this debate was pretty high, although there was slightly less viewership on this debate compared to the first debate between Biden and Trump. And as you can see here, majority of Americans heard at least something about the debate, although less than half heard, a great deal about it. But overall, it's something that a lot of Americans were paying attention to. But although that said, most of the Americans that were paying close attention to this debate are already Americans that were registered to vote and were certain to vote, suggesting, that most people that are paying attention to it were already following the election closely and, likely have already made up their mind. So, the biggest question, look after the debate is, did this debate change anybody's mind? Will this debate change the presidential race in a significant way? We'll dig into that in a second. So on the next slide, getting sort of American snap reactions to the debate. So this is a graphic among registered voters who heard at least something about the debate. As you can see here, as a whole, this data shows that Harris did pretty well in the debate at around a 2-to-1 margin. Americans felt Harris, quote unquote, won the debate. You can't really win it, but they felt that Harris won the debate. They also felt that Trump, more than Harris, stumbled, didn't appear sharp. And also rated Harris a bit more favorably on a lot of these other items, like being hopeful about the future, etc. But overall, signs point to a positive showing for Harris during the debate. But on the next slide, we sort of dig into the impact, if there was an impact at all, the debate had. So pretty much, when you look at the top line numbers of, who Americans are actually planning to vote for after the debate, there wasn't really a huge change. If you look at the All Americans columns on the left, going from +4 to +5, that's not really a change. Statistically, that's basically the same, suggesting, that as a whole, there really wasn't a huge change in people's voting intention after the debate. Similar across Democrats and Republicans, these partisans really didn't change their minds much after the debate. But we do see that among independents, there was a slight shift, going from +6 for Kamala to +11 for Kamala after the debate. On the next slide, we dig into independents a bit more. So first, a little bit of context on independents. This is a growing group of Americans who are identifying as independents. However, we do see that most independents actually act more like partisans when it comes to who they vote for in elections. So for example, independents that lean Republican or independents that lean Democrat pretty much overwhelmingly support that party's candidate, either Trump or Harris. Independents that lean Republican are slightly more likely to support Harris over independents that lean Democrat supporting Trump. But these people mostly act like partisans. There wasn't huge shifts among those two groups of independents, but we do see a slight shift after the debate among independents who don't lean either Republican or Democrat. Again, this is a small group, under half of independents, over a third of independents, though still a small-ish group, so the sample size isn't huge here, but this is enough to see a slight statistically significant bump among this independent no-lean group. But again, this group is less politically engaged than other groups. Most of these independent no-leans are undecided or non-voters. They don't tend to turn out in huge numbers. So it'll be worth watching whether Harris can, maintain her lead among this independent no-lean group, and whether she can actually turn these people out to vote, because again, these people tend to be less politically engaged than, partisans or independents that lean towards one party or another. Next slide. So getting into turnout and likely voter modeling. So the big issue with political polling when it comes to elections is, predicting who's actually going to vote. It's sort of like an added layer of uncertainty on top of, getting the actual poll correct. You also have to predict who's going to actually vote. As you can see here, turnout for the past maybe 2 decades in the 2000s has hovered around the sort of 60% mark when it comes to turnout. Obviously in 2020 and the last election cycle, we saw record turnout at around 2/3 of Americans that are voting, but really showing that not a lot of Americans are actually voting. This is among the voting eligible population, so excluding people like non-citizens or felons, and only around 2/3 of Americans at most turn out to an election. So that's a big challenge for pollsters, is predicting who is going to actually vote, which is why pollsters use likely voter models in order to get an estimate of who is going to actually vote. And so this is something you'll see from us a lot more going forward, is our likely voter modeling. This is things that other people do as well. For our likely voter model, we look at 3 variables. So that is someone's registered voter status, their likelihood to vote, and their past voting history. And then we take these 3 variables and sort of give each respondent a score of how likely we think they are to vote, and then take, the top scorers, top roughly 60% of scorers, again, in line with the turnout we've seen over the past 2 decades, and use that to sort of build our electorate of people we think are going to vote, and then that's how we decide, who is a likely voter, who isn't a likely voter. On the next slide. So as you can see here, when we do look at our likely voter model, we do get slightly different results than when we look at, all respondents or maybe registered voters or registered voters that are certain to vote, really showing that, it does matter who you pick to vote. That can have a slight marginal impact to a pretty significant 2 or 3 point impact, depending on the sample you look at. So the sample we really want to focus on is this likely voter models, particularly the average turnout one, where we take the top 60% of people we think are likely to vote, look at the ballot between them. We also see that if we assume a high turnout rate at 70% on the far right, that leans more towards Harris, suggesting, if we do see very high turnout in this election, it's more likely to favor Harris than Trump. But again, just showing that, varying samples do affect the ballot. Next slide. So this slide shows sort of how turnout would be affected, or how turnout among different demographics would be affected by turnout. So on the left, our points is the percent of turnout in a median turnout scenario. So if 60% of the population, 27% of Americans aged 18 to 29 would vote, compared to a high turnout scenario where 70% of Americans vote. Again, that's higher than it was in 2020, but this is hypothetical. Around 50% of 18 to 29-year-old Americans would vote. And this sort of shows that, young Americans have a high capacity to be turned out. Right now, not a lot of them are likely voters, but if, high turnout scenarios do happen, this is an area where Democrats could see major gains in. At the same time, for Republicans, they may look towards white, non-college educated Americans or Americans that don't have a college degree as ways to, or as pools of potential support for both these groups. On the next slide, we sort of see the relative impact these groups would have if they turned out, if they had a high turnout. So for example, if urban or suburban Americans had a high turnout, it would benefit Harris by about 2 percentage points, whereas if white non-college educated Americans had a high turnout, that would benefit Trump around 1%. Again, this sort of shows which groups are, I guess, most important heading into the election for either Trump or Harris to focus on, and groups that we should be paying attention to because they have big pools of potential voters that lean either more towards Harris or more towards Trump. So I know Trump, a big focus of his campaign is getting these low propensity voters to turn out and vote. So that might be something to watch But again, to sort of tie this whole section together, predicting who's going to actually vote is difficult, which is why we employ likely voter models that look at a variety of factors based on someone's historical data and someone's likelihood to vote in the future. And we use that to give an estimate of who we think is going to vote. Right now, it looks like Harris would benefit in a high turnout scenario, whereas Trump would benefit in a lower turnout scenario. Again, groups like younger Americans or white non-college educated Americans, rural Americans, those are the groups really to watch to see how they're behaving, how they're turning out as potential signs of whether Trump or Harris may be benefiting from turnout in these areas. But yeah, with that said, I will go ahead and turn things back over to Sarah, who's going to talk a bit more about the election. Sarah?
Thanks so much, Bernard. Yeah, so interesting, all those turnout, really important for understanding the election and what might happen. Now, like we said, the presidential election is not the only election happening this year. There's a number of different other races. And we're going to start off this section talking first about the House. Right now, the House looks likely to be very closely divided. Now, as a recap refresher, your House of Representative candidate is up for re-election every 2 years, so they're scrappy, they're always kind of campaigning. That's what Nancy Pelosi always referred to the House as and described these types of elections. And you can see that here. This is a very, very, Republicans right now have a very narrow majority that looks likely to continue post-November, perhaps. There's a couple toss-up races, but the House right now looks very divided, and you can kind of see that in our generic congressional ballot. So this is where we ask Americans, how they would vote for a Democrat or a Republican in the district they live. It's very expensive. It's very difficult to do district level polling in all of these different races. So we generally get a sense of how the mood of the country by asking this generic ballot question. And we can see that there's a +1 Democrat, but the takeaway here is really that it's very close, very divided. And you can see that in how these different House races play out and the likely leans of each side. Now that carries forward too when we look at the Senate a little bit more closely. Now, the Senate is different than the House in that only a third of Senate seats are up for election this year. And as you can see here, that's the kind of yellow circled in the middle of that chart on the left. And if you look at those circles, you can see that there are more blue circles than red circles. And that's to say that Democrats this cycle are defending more seats. So the map looks a little bit more favorable for Republicans. There are more Republicans that are not up for re-election this year. That just makes the map a little bit more favorable for them, since there's nothing to defend there. But again, the mood of the country right now, as we've all talked about so far in this presentation, is one of deep division and close races. That's kind of the feeling, the sentiment right here, and you can kind of see that playing out in both the generic ballot and just the way that the narrow majorities that each party now holds in different parts of Congress. And that holds very important implications for whoever wins in November, whoever wins the White House in November. That matters for how and who they're governing with. It's the difference between passing legislation and not. So paying attention to what the House and Senate looks like after November is also very important in understanding who and what might happen come 2025. Now, moving away from federal elections and looking at the state here, we have 11 gubernatorial elections going on this year as well. As you can see, a number of the states that are having governor's races are held by Republican incumbents. There are two real states to pay attention to. One is in North Carolina, the other is in New Hampshire. The New Hampshire race is important to pay attention to because it's very, very close between Craig and Kelly Ayotte. So very interesting race to watch there. And then North Carolina, of course, because it not only is there a governor's race happening, but it is also a swing state in this presidential election. So also very important for charting different paths to victory for each side, for each candidate. And right now, it's also very important to watch because there's been a lot of scandals roiling that campaign over the past few days, few weeks. Josh Stein, the Democratic candidate, is polling better than Lieutenant Governor Mark Robertson by quite a bit, and that was true even before all these scandals. But these races and even these ballot measures, which we'll get into in the next slide, interact and can interact with the presidential election, and the campaigns and turnouts there in important ways too. So kind of paying attention to some of these other races going on is important too, in understanding the full picture of and the political context the presidential election is happening in. And you can kind of see that on the right, where with the interplay between the 2020 presidential outcome and the 2020 gubernatorial races in these states, there's some mismatch, not straight partisan voting, and that is a place to watch here as well in this cycle. Now, like I mentioned, there are also important ballot measures being voted upon in a number of states, particularly around abortion. A few swing states or swingier states have abortion, constitutional rights for abortion that are going to be voted on in November, particularly Nevada and Arizona. You know, Florida, not really so much swing states, swingier perhaps, but that could have the ballot measure on abortion. It could have important implications for the Senate race going on there. Likewise with Montana and the ballot measure up there for abortion and the Senate race going on there. So that is to say that we tend to talk sometimes about these elections as a singular event and in silos. So the presidential election is talked about here, and then the governor's race is talked about here, and the abortion ballot measure is talked about here, but they're all being voted on at the same time, and they're all existing in the same political context. And we've seen historically how ballot measures can impact outcome and turnout, particularly in 2004 with different defense of marriage. Ballot measures that were being rolled out, kind of helping George W. Bush and his reelection. So important to pay attention to the full context of the presidential picture right now. But to ground this very briefly in polling, because that's kind of our jam here, to get the mood of the country, overall registered voters are more in favor of protecting or increasing access to abortion rather than reducing or ending access. So that is, again, an important kind of sign or indicator to be paying attention to for kind of the general mood of the country. Of course, there are state differences that can play out, but as we've seen since Dobbs, these abortion ballot measures tend to really energize the Democratic base, increase fundraising, donations, and turnout. And we haven't seen that play out yet in a presidential cycle, but that is kind of the context and important facts to keep in mind as we move into the last stretch of the campaign. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris, who will talk us through the rest of 2024 and the forecast. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate it. So we have lots of interesting things happening at the state and local level. And now we will look at the presidential race again, because that is, I think, what people care about oftentimes the most, even if it may not actually be the thing that has the biggest impact. We do think approval ratings tend to be a key measure, as we've mentioned in past webinars. And Biden's approval rating particularly is essentially a proxy for how popular the government is. And we see his approval rating remains pretty tepid, 39% in our polling, 40 to 42% in the averages, the public averages. And that's not necessarily a very strong number, wouldn't be a strong number for Biden if he were still the candidate, certainly isn't a strong number for Harris. And looking at elections around the world in this kind of scenario where we have a successor candidate running for a election with a unpopular president or chief executive, they tend to not win. Indeed, in this sort of scenario, a successor candidate would only win about 1 in 8 times with trying to run in this kind of case, suggesting that the fundamentals of the election are still a little bit stacked against Harris. Now, I think one of the interesting confounding factors is there is a little bit of uncertainty or confusion around who is the incumbent. We do have a former president running against a sitting vice president. Harris is in some ways sort of running as a change candidate, and depending on how you ask the question, Trump is seen as more of a change figure, or Harris is seen as more of a change figure, again, suggesting that it's not necessarily as clear-cut as one may think of just looking at the incumbent and who's the incumbent or not. But this fundamentals model does suggest that Trump should be viewed as more of a favorite, all things equal. Another thing we always look at that we've referred to in the past is what the main issue landscape is and how the candidates match up on that main issue, because typically whoever's seen as stronger on that leading issue tends to win. Again, looking at elections around the world, the candidate who's strongest on the main issue wins most of the time. Now, what we see here is that Donald Trump is a little bit stronger on the main issue of the economy or inflation by 7-8 points. A significant lead, but not a huge lead, and that would suggest that he should be viewed again as the favorite here. Now, again, though, there is some confounding information. One, what I mentioned at the top of the call about the issue landscape actually being a bit fuzzier than it's just the economy. There's all the vibes, there's the sort of desire for change or for a different system, things like that, that sort of shift up what's the priority. But again, I think all things equal, the fundamentals suggest that Trump, both Biden's approval and this main issue, that Trump should be viewed as perhaps the favorite in the election. But then we have the polls themselves, which, are the thing that we kind of oftentimes pay the most attention to, not always to our benefit. And the polls are painting a slightly different picture. So we have at the national level, depending on which aggregator, 538 or Real Clear Politics you're looking at, Harris is leading by 2 to 3 percentage points, as well as having a honestly negligible lead in the Midwestern swing states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin of 1 to 2 points, while Trump has a negligible lead in the southern swing states of North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona, with Nevada being just really, truly a tie. And in that sort of context, Harris is looking a little bit stronger. That's, of course, assuming there's not a poll error, which honestly, there oftentimes is a poll error, but guessing the directionality of the poll error is a bit of a fool's errand. Certainly in 2016 and 2020, polls understated Donald Trump, but in 2022 and in 2012, actually, polls overstated Democrats slightly. So there's definitely has been errors in both directions. There has been a lot of methodological changes this cycle where pollsters are doing a lot of different stuff to try to make sure they're capturing the Trump vote. So again, I don't necessarily think we can forecast the directionality of the errors, but the polling does suggest Harris is in a little bit of a stronger place than the fundamentals models do. So we have these sort of conflicting messages or conflicting pictures sort of telling us what's happening. So what do? Well, then we sort of take it all together to build our forecast. And it's important to remember that we don't treat an individual poll or even an aggregate of a poll as a forecast. Instead, a poll is a snapshot of the past, maybe the recent past, but still the past. We're asking people to predict their own behavior, as Bernard was sort of showing in the likely voter section. Maybe they're good at it, maybe they're not good at it. So to build a forecast, we like to look at a lot of different indicators, a lot of different things to sort of reach more of a summary judgment rather than just that one poll. So one of the things we look at is what are the other professional forecasters, or sorry, this is the scenarios. We're still just in a messy scenario. We skip past this to the experts. Yeah, so one of the things we like to look at is what are the other professionals saying, what sort of is out there. And right now, almost all of the professional forecasters are still saying the election's a toss-up. Too close to call, with those 7 swing states essentially being too close to call. The more poll-based models are leaning towards Harris, though again, they're all sort of saying it's too early or too close to call. I was just this morning on 538's modeled projection, which they have about a 63-64% Harris when I was looking at it, which is, solidly Harris, but certainly not overwhelmingly. It's essentially 1 in 3 odds for Trump. And again, they're sort of saying it's too early because their error bars are highly overlapping. So it's, again, not a clear thing. The one person who actually is sort of making a call for Harris right now, which we haven't added to this, but we need to, is Alan Lichtman, who's a sort of a famous pundit guy who has his like 15 keys to the White House methodology, which is a little bit funky, kind of an interesting sort of story, but a little bit funky of an approach. But anyways, he's saying Harris is going to win, though he's not overwhelmingly saying she's going to win. So he's the one person who's already calling it for him. But he, again, has his sort of keys-based model, as opposed to all of these people who are much more looking at the states and trying to call the individual states and then add up the electoral college. So our indicators are pushing in different directions. The experts aren't really providing any guidance. So what do? We look at all of these things together to create our summary judgment. And the polls are maybe a little bit favorable to Harris, the national level in the Midwest, but probably tied in the Southeast and the Southwest. Our polling, Ipsos's polling, is sort of showing it as a tie. Maybe, again, slightly more Harris leaning nationally, but close enough that we're still calling it a tie. The base rate, the Biden approval based model, very favorable towards Trump. The main issue landscape, very favorable towards Trump. But some other things that we're looking at as sort of indications of the effectiveness of the campaigns are pointing in Harris's direction. Her fundraising has been incredible, honestly, since she's come on board. She has like $100 million advantage in cash on hand right now over the Trump campaign. She's still continuing to dominate attention, getting more attention than Trump is, which again is kind of a unique thing happening in the last couple of months. Trump has traditionally dominated attention over the last 8 years, and is essentially kind of winning the campaigns, which in a close election may end up being a deciding factor. But when you sort of take all of these things together, you add them all together, you still end up with a toss-up. It is still too close to call. We think Trump is slightly more favored in the South, the Southeast and the Southwest, but for Harris to win, she really just needs to win those 3 Midwestern states plus the Nebraska 2nd District, which doesn't seem like it's going to get monkey wrenched into a winner-take-all thing, as there was a late effort by Trump allies to do. So with the Midwest still a toss-up, the national picture still a toss-up, this election remains very close to call with 6 weeks to go, where Ipsos's sort of official position is that it's a 50-50 or 55-45 race, but it still could go either way, and it will likely come down to what happens with the economy over the next 6 weeks and how people feel about the economy. The trends are in Harris's direction, but who knows, right? And then the campaign effectiveness, right? And are the campaigns effective at getting their message out? Harris has closed the gap on that economy as the main issue. Biden was down much more substantively earlier this year, but she's much closer on that. Some of that is attributable to her messaging on the issue. And things like getting out the vote, right? Getting your people to turn out, which Bernard was talking about, and those sort of differential turnout rates. Do Democrats get big turnout from those urban and suburban areas where they most of their supporters are, versus Trump getting a strong Republican turnout from rural areas or non-college whites, or sort of some of those groups that he performs better with? These are some of the factors that are going to ultimately decide the election. So with that, I think we will open it up for questions. Please do not hesitate to use the Q&A feature in the GoToMeeting application, and then we will answer as many questions as we have time for. If we don't have time for your question, please, if you put your name in it, we will email you a response after we're done if we don't have a chance to get to your question. First one, I remember from previous things that a likely voter filter would make polling outcomes are Republican favoring, but now it seems like that's flipped. Yeah, so that's, I think, yes, we're seeing that. That seems to be pretty common among all polls being done right now. And what I think is happening, and actually you could sort of see it in Bernard's slide, is the traditional high turnout populations, particularly white college-educated Americans, up to 2016 were more Republican than Democrat, tended to vote more Republican than not. But since 2016, that group has turned to be more Democratic than Republican, which means that Democrats actually have a slight advantage with a smaller electorate than Republicans do. Instead, Republicans, and particularly Donald Trump, rely on turning out lower propensity voters to win. So it's a bit of a realignment in American politics, where traditionally the highest turnout populations have been white college-educated Americans and Black women, right? And they used to offset. Black women voted heavily Democrat, white college-educated voted highly Republican, but now they both vote more Democratic than not, which helps Democrats in lower turnout races, like midterms, which is we've seen Democrats sort of overperforming a little bit in midterm elections. And it is an interesting realignment that has happened really in sort of the Trump era. Next question, who stands more for change? Sarah, you want to take that one? We've gotten some data on that.
That is a great question. As Chris alluded to in the presentation, it is kind of an open question and kind of subject to how people are interpreting it. And there's arguments to be made for both sides. Harris, being part of the current administration, could be seen as more of the incumbent or more of the steady state continuity, and Trump could be seen as an outsider, but of course he is also the former president. And right now, when we look at some other pollsters and our own testing on this front, we can see that there's some indication that Harris is kind of seen a little bit more changey, but again, I think it's not a very clear-cut example scenario. And again, this is just like we've been saying this a lot, but it is a very strange election. I think it's very easy to normalize everything that's happened over the past month and a half. But it is putting us in a very unusual position, one where we haven't seen the likes of since the 1800s. So shout out to Grover Cleveland. So it is a very unusual situation. There's some indication that Harris might be seen a little bit more as the change candidate, but again, it's a little murky. I don't know, Chris, if you have anything to add to that.
No, I think that's right. And I think because it's so murky, because we don't have a more simple, incumbent versus challenger type scenario, the campaigns are actually potentially more important because they're sort of defining that. And I think this is a place where the Harris campaign, which has been somewhat effective since she sort of ascended to become the Democratic nominee, has sort of built some of that advantage we've seen. And Trump, Trump had traditionally been sort of the most gifted political communicator in the last, couple of decades, not necessarily the nicest, but certainly the one that was best at getting the media to follow his, what he wanted to talk about. And while he's still able to do that, the, eating the pets crazy stuff that sort of started, it's not really been as effective as it has been in the past. So I think the Trump campaign has really sort of been struggling in a way that they weren't struggling even earlier this year to sort of get their message out beyond sort of the, conservative media ecosystem. Now, I think the one advantage Trump continues to have is that people who get their news from conservative media is about a third of his vote, but the other 2/3 are more people who get their news from social media or local media or no real source. And those people are kind of resistant to messaging. So, they're hard for the Harris campaign to reach, to dissuade, but they're also potentially hard for the Trump campaign to reach, to encourage. I think that's part of why Trump's base is so resilient. So yeah, I think Trump has some challenges in terms of getting his base to turn out at levels above essentially what he's done in the past. So 46, 47, 48% of the vote finally. He'll have a hard time getting past that. Let's see, how does the money race with Harris Walz out fundraising Trump Vance in recent months affect GOTV efforts? Does the Democratic advantage in money translate to more GOTV, higher turnout, and how? It's not necessarily a direct one-to-one correlation, but having more money essentially usually translates to having more ads on TV. And I think for Harris, that's important because even though everybody knows her name, she's still not quite as familiar to Americans as Trump is. So being able to sort of win that advertising campaign, that effort to sort of brand herself will be important. The GOTV effort oftentimes is more about volunteers, and that's another place where the Harris campaign seems to be winning. There's been lots of reports, and this is hard to get good data on, but there's been lots of reports about substantial numbers of volunteers enlisting in the Harris-Walz campaign since she became the nominee. And those are the people that are going to be sort of running GOTV on election day. And the more people you have, the more contacts you can make, the more people you can get to the polls. And GOTV efforts have been shown to not have a huge impact, but a percentage point or 3 on election results, which again, in a very close election, might be the difference between winning and losing. How do the polls account for electoral college and presidential polling? Sarah, Bernard, one of you want to take that?
I can hop on that.
Yeah.
Bernard, if you have anything you want to add. So, yeah, I think the national poll numbers that we're often talking about is the national poll numbers. It is not actually fully tied to what ends up happening on election day, because as you point out, the electoral college is important in determining who ends up winning. It's not a straight popular vote like elsewhere. So the way polling accounts for that is by doing state-based polling to get a sense of how different people in the key swing states are thinking and feeling about the election. You saw that in the slide Chris presented on the poll aggregators across a number of the different key swing states. We're doing our own kind of regional look at the swing states where we're following the same group of Americans over the course of the election to understand how people in those swing states are thinking about the election and changing their attitudes on it. So stay tuned for that, because that's very important in understanding, again, what might actually end up happening in the electoral college.
Yeah, definitely. I think this next one might be, Sarah, for you as well. What factors might make people feel better about their personal finances, household purchases, increasing or decreasing gas prices, purchase prices, things like that?
That is a great question. And again, somewhat of a murky one, a theme of this election, and I think some of this presentation. We've done some testing on the main issue, like Chris alluded to, and some of the nuances around how people are thinking about the economy. And some of that is not just inflation, not just rising costs, but the sense of opportunity, the sense of can I build a future for myself? Do I have the resources to do that? Can I move ahead? And when we look at that, that's kind of more general and nebulous, but, can be tied to housing costs, can be tied to some of these more systemic and longer term problems that many Americans are dealing with, and goes a little beyond just the price of eggs or the price of gas. So that is, I think, a nuance, again, about this kind of moment the economy is in, coming out of the pandemic, coming out of a very high period of inflation that is putting us in a little bit of a different position for how people are relating to the economy and what they're really looking for when they're saying, I have a problem with the economy right now.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the actual sort of economic experience variables, they are equivalent to periods where sort of consumer sentiment was much more positive, and it does suggest that there is a measure or a portion of sort of the current environment that's sort of really just sort of outlook based, like people feel pessimistic because they feel pessimistic, right? People feel pessimistic about the economy because they feel pessimistic. And it does sort of go back to the vibes that you've heard reference to in other places, and there is, potentially room for that to shift relatively dramatically. We saw that in the spring of 2021 as a consequence of the vaccine rollout, where people sort of went from a relatively negative sort of view to an extremely positive one. They had money in their pockets from the government stimulus from the pandemic. The vaccine sort of promised to, let us all have that hot vaxxed summer. And then we ran into the Delta wave of the pandemic, and it sort of caused all of that to crash. And then inflation started picking up, which really caused it to crash. But a lot of that swing we saw in the spring and summer of 2021 wasn't purely because people had so much more money. It was sort of that, again, vibes or sort of other factor, the vaccine-driven factor. So there is potentially room for these to swing abruptly. Not that we're saying that we expect it to happen. That is one of the big factors we're seeing feeding into the economy. Let's see. Last question I see, and if anyone has any questions, please don't hesitate to put them into the Q&A button. Can we share the attention metrics we're using for Harris and Trump? The one I like to look at the most is just looking at Google Trends and searching for, Harris and Donald Trump, the different versions of that. Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, Harris, Trump, whatever. And just comparing them over different time frames, different geographies, just to sort of see. And again, if you do that, you can see that Donald Trump kind of dominated from 2016 to now to earlier this year. But then, starting this summer, particularly once Biden stepped down, Harris has been leading on that, by at least 2-1, if not maybe a little bit more. And I think that is an important indicator of sort of what people are actually doing, right? That's Google Trends is what people are searching for, and more people are searching for Harris than for Trump, which I think is an important sort of thing just to note. I wouldn't use it as a projection, that doesn't mean she's going to win or anything else like that, but it does just again suggest the directionality of the campaign effects. Other people do things like looking at the amount of TV coverage or news media coverage they both get, and that's a bit more of a balanced one because Trump does continue to be the darling of people trying to move newspaper copy. But in terms of actual what people are looking for, Harris seems to be sort of continuing to dominate that. I think those are all the questions we have. So if you do have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're certainly at your disposal. Like I mentioned, this information is all public and you're welcome to it. Ellen, I think I'll pass it over to you to close things up.
All right, wonderful. I do think that there's a few questions popping in, but I will get Chris and the team here to respond to you directly by email. Also want everyone to know that our next webinar is on October 24th, and you will see an invite to that very shortly. The registration form is already live on our website. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Chris, Sarah, and Bernard. Always a dynamic discussion, really enjoyed it. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you.